Neoliberalism is often misunderstood as merely a set of economic policies promoting free markets and deregulation. But for workers, neoliberalism represents a much deeper system of exploitation, designed to shift power and wealth upwards, consolidating capitalist class domination. Rooted in historical crises, neoliberalism emerged as a response to the declining profitability of capitalism, promoted by elites' interests to secure their control over labour and resources. In this video, we'll explore how neoliberalism isn't just about free markets or deregulation, but a deeply entrenched system of class exploitation designed to shift wealth and power continuously upwards. We'll examine how neoliberalism emerged out of economic crises in the 1970s, using privatization, deregulation and austerity to weaken workers' rights while benefiting the wealthy. Drawing on critiques from David Harvey, Silvia Federici and Samir Amin, we'll break down how this system impacts you as a worker and a citizen today, showing how neoliberalism continues to shape our world to the advantage of capital at your expense. So the most basic question to start with is, what is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism itself is an economic ideology that gained prominence in the 1970s and the 1980s, advocating for the primacy of markets, privatization, deregulation and reduced state intervention in the economy. Neoliberalism was developed in response to the economic crises of the 1970s, which followed decades of Keynesianism, which is an economic approach that involved significant state intervention in markets to maintain full employment and reduce inequality within countries. However, David Harvey, in his influential work A Brief History of Neoliberalism from 2005, argues that neoliberalism is more than an economic policy shift. It's a class project to restore capitalist profitability to the elites by reasserting the power of the ruling class over labour. Harvey asserts that neoliberalism allows capitalists to exploit workers more intensely, breaking down the institutions that once protected workers' rights, such as trade unions and welfare programs. By shifting the burden of economic risk from the state and international capital to the workers, neoliberalism serves to consolidate wealth in the hands of a global elite. The political origins of neoliberalism. The economic crises of the 1970s is often presented as an inevitable consequence of Keynesian economic policies, but this narrative is deeply flawed. Samir Amin, in his analysis of the global capitalist system, highlights how the stagflation crisis of the 1970s, which was the combination of stagnating growth and high inflation, was partly engineered by the geopolitical interests of the United States, particularly through its rejection of the Bretton Woods system built after World War II and the creation of the petrodollar system in 1971. In 1971, the USA abandoned the gold standard, which had previously anchored global currencies, and struck a deal with Saudi Arabia to ensure that all oil transactions would be made in dollars moving forwards, creating the petrodollar system. This move secured US dominance over global markets, but also triggered a global inflationary spiral. Rather than doubling down on Keynesian policies to stabilize the crisis, US policymakers used the crisis as a pretext to shift towards monetarist policies, advocated by neoliberal economists like Milton Friedman. Amin critiques how the US, under the guise of solving stagflation, imposed neoliberal restructuring on the global economy, particularly through its own institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which then demanded structural adjustment policies which in turn deepened global inequalities. These policies, cloaked in the language of economic freedom, devastated the global south, forcing nations to privatize public goods and cut their social spending, all while serving the interests of US financial capital. One of the central features of neoliberalism is deregulation, particularly in labour markets. Stuart Hall, in his seminal work on Thatcherism and Neoliberalism, argued that neoliberalism redefined the relationship between the state, capital, and labour by systematically dismantling the regulatory frameworks that protected workers. The goal of this was to create a more flexible labour force, which is code for reducing job security, weakening unions, and lowering wages. For workers in many countries in the world, this has meant the rise of precarious labour. Jobs that were once full-time, stable, and often unionised have been replaced by temporary contracts, gig work, and part-time positions. Silvia Federici highlights this shift in her work on reproductive labour, noting that the neoliberal attack on public services and labour rights disproportionately affects women, who are increasingly forced into insecure, unpaid, or underpaid work in both formal and informal economies. The flexibilization of labour has not liberated workers as it claimed. It instead has made them more vulnerable to exploitation, while capital accumulates wealth at their expense. Federici's analysis underscores the Marxist critique of surplus value extraction under neoliberalism, which is the value that workers produce is increasingly separated from the compensation that they receive. Gig workers, for example, are paid only for the immediate service they provide, while the platforms such as Uber, Deliveroo, etc. extract massive profits without bearing the costs of employment benefits, job security, or workers' rights. Privatization is another hallmark of neoliberalism. Public goods and services, such as healthcare, education, utilities, and transportation, are sold off to private corporations in the name of efficiency. David Harvey argues that privatization is nothing more than a dispossession by accumulation, a process through which the working class is stripped of all collective assets and forced to pay for services that were once public rights. Healthcare privatization, for example, has led to skyrocketing costs and reduced access for workers, while corporate profits in the health industry have soared. Wendy Brown, in her book Undoing the Demos from 2015, explains how neoliberalism commodifies all aspects of life, turning everything from education to healthcare into a product that must be bought. This shifts the notion of citizenship from being about collective rights to one of individual consumerism, where each person is expected to invest in their own well-being, while the state retreats from its role in providing for the public good. For workers, privatization represents a direct assault on their well-being. Once public services are now run for profit, and workers must navigate an increasingly marketized world, where healthcare, education, and even basic utilities are treated as commodities rather than rights. This transformation reduces public goods to consumer products, subjecting them to the logic of the market and further deepening inequality. Neoliberalism is also often equated with globalization, and for good reason. The removal of trade barriers, the liberalization of capital markets, and the creation of the global supply chains have transformed the global economy under neoliberalism since 1970. But this process, which neoliberalism presents as a win-win scenario, has in fact exacerbated global inequalities. David McNally, in his book Global Slump from 2011, argues that neoliberal globalization has led to a race to the bottom for workers, particularly in the global south, where wages are continually suppressed and labour standards are virtually non-existent. As capital becomes more mobile, it seeks out the cheapest labour, often in countries where workers have little or no bargaining power. This creates a global system of exploitation in which workers are pitted against one another in a competitive race to lower wages and cut benefits. For workers in the global north, this has meant the deindustrialization of economies, where well-paying manufacturing jobs have been outsourced to countries with cheaper labour, leaving behind precarious, low-wage service sector jobs. Neoliberalism presents this as global competition, but Marxist theories like McNally show that it is a calculated effort to weaken labour markets worldwide, making it easier for capital to exploit both domestic and international workers. Neoliberalism often markets itself as the champion of individual freedom. By emphasizing personal responsibility and quote-unquote choice, it frames social problems like poverty, unemployment, and lack of access to healthcare or other essential services as individual failings rather than systemic issues. Wendy Brown critiques this ideological framework in her book Undoing the Demos, where she argues that neoliberalism reduces individuals to, quote, entrepreneurs of the self, end quote, responsible for managing every aspect of their own lives within constantly competitive markets. This ideology masks the reality of power under neoliberalism. Workers are less free, not more. The collapse of social safety nets and the weakening of labour rights leave individuals more vulnerable to market fluctuations, while corporate elites, on the other hand, enjoy greater freedom to exploit. Karl Marx's concept of alienation, which is the separation of workers from the products of their labour and from each other, is thus deepened under neoliberalism, as individuals become more atomized and are encouraged to see themselves as isolated actors rather than part of a collective struggle. The myth of freedom is also used to justify privatization, austerity, and cuts to public services, with politicians often arguing that these measures will give individuals more quote-unquote choice. But David Harvey points out, neoliberalism doesn't deliver real freedoms to the masses. It merely frees capital from the constraints of regulation and the demands of social justice and democracy. Neoliberalism is not a neutral or inevitable system. It is a deliberate project designed to enhance the power of capital and the elite at the expense of labour or workers. By dismantling labour protections, privatising public goods, and promoting precarious work, neoliberalism intensifies exploitation while offering nothing in return to workers except insecurity and constant competition. But, as David Harvey, Silvia Federici, and Samir Amin remind us, neoliberalism is not invincible. It's a system full of contradictions that can be exploited by workers who can see them and their movements in order to demand alternatives. Understanding neoliberalism through a Marxist lens reveals that the crisis workers face today, whether it's job insecurity, rising inequality, or the erosion of public services, are not the result of personal failings or natural economic laws. They are, in fact, the product of a system designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. But just as Marx predicted, the contradictions of capitalism, accelerated by neoliberalism, also sow the seeds for its own downfall. The struggle against neoliberalism is ultimately a struggle for a more just and equitable world, one in which workers control the wealth that they create and public goods are treated as rights, not commodities. We've been the Left Library, and we hope this video has helped you to comprehend what neoliberalism looks like in today's world. If you do have any questions, please drop them in the comments section below, or if you enjoyed today's video, please do subscribe to the Left Library for more simplified political theory. Thank you, and until next time.